Yeah, welcome back to the channel. Today we discuss the endocrine system as well as homeostasis. Right. Now, when we talk of the endocrine system and homeostasis, now this is a system that is involved with maintaining a balance internally within the human body. And that maintenance of balance is what we refer as homeostasis. Now, homeostasis simply describes how the body is able to maintain a constant internal environment. So the internal environment remains more or less the same. And the endocrine system here plays a role in maintaining the internal environment. Now, exactly how does this endocrine system function to maintain homeostasis? How does it function to maintain a constant internal environment? Well, we have to look at the idea of what is called a hormone. Now, what is a hormone? A hormone is said to be a chemical messenger. And this chemical messenger that we describe as a hormone, it is made up of proteins. So all hormones, irrespective of their variety, irrespective of their names, it is important to note that all hormones are made up of proteins. And because these hormones are made up of protein, it is important to note that if you were to receive a supplement of hormones, you are not supposed to take hormones orally. They are supposed to be injected. Why is this the case? Now, you are not supposed to take hormones orally simply because these hormones, they are proteins. And if you ingest the hormones orally, they are going to be digested in the stomach. And when proteins are digested in the stomach, they're going to be digested into amino acids. Why amino acids? Because amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So when you do absorb the hormones that you ingested orally, you're not going to absorb them as hormones. You're going to absorb them as amino acids. And as such, they're going to be ineffective. So if you are to receive a supplement of hormones, you are supposed to have them injected directly into the bloodstream. That way, they are going to reach the target organ faster, and they're also going to be effective. Right. Now, the hormones that we're speaking of, they're secreted by a special type of gland that we find within the human body. Now, here we're going to focus on two types of glands, which is one, we've got an endocrine gland, and two, we've got an exocrine gland. Now, these are both glands that are found within the human body, and we must be able to differentiate between the two different types of glands. Now, let's look at what is called an endocrine gland. Now, an endocrine gland is said to be a gland that secretes hormones. But not only does this gland secrete hormones, these hormones are secreted or they are poured directly into the bloodstream. So an endocrine gland, number one, has to secrete a hormone. But not only does it secrete a hormone, the hormone secreted, it must be secreted directly into the bloodstream. That is an endocrine gland. But let's look at an exocrine gland. How does it differ from an exocrine gland? Well, an exocrine gland is said to secrete its secretions by means of what? Of ducts. So it is important to note with exocrine glands, we do not specify the secretions of the exocrine gland as hormones. And this is simply because an exocrine gland does not secrete hormones. Hence, we simply say secretions. Now, these secretions of the exocrine gland, they are poured by means of what? Of ducts. So now let's try to compare between the two. Let's try to compare the description of an endocrine gland as well as the description of an exocrine. How do they differ? And we do that by means of this table. First of all, we said that an endocrine gland is going to secrete hormones. And that is still the case. But exocrine glands do not secrete hormones. So hormones are only secreted by endocrine glands. Exocrine glands, they do not secrete hormones. Remember, we said that hormones, these are simply chemical messengers. They are made up of proteins. Number two, we said that the secretions of the endocrine gland, They are poured directly into the bloodstream. Now we know that the secretions of the endocrine glands are simply what? Hormones. So the hormones that are secreted by these endocrine glands, they are going to be poured directly into the bloodstream. But let's look at the secretions of the exocrine glands. Now, the secretion of the exocrine gland, we said that they transport their secretions by means of what? Of ducts. So they differ because the secretions of endocrine glands here, they're transported in the bloodstream. But the secretions of exocrine glands, they are transported by means of what? Of ducts. So that is how we differentiate between an endocrine gland as well as an exocrine gland. Now, let's try to look at one particular gland that we're going to focus on later on, and that gland is what we call the pancreas. Now, why do we have to focus on the pancreas here? It is simply because the pancreas is said to be the only gland within the human body that we can describe as both being an endocrine gland as well as an exocrine. How is this the case? Well, the pancreas is an example of an endocrine gland in the sense that, number one, it secretes hormones. And the hormones that are secreted by the pancreas is the hormone insulin as well as the hormone glucagon. So those are hormones. But it also qualifies to be an exocrine gland in the sense that it also secretes pancreatic juice. Now, this pancreatic juice, number one, it is not a hormone. And number two, it is transported by means of ducts. As a matter of fact, the duct that is responsible for transporting pancreatic juice, we simply call it a pancreatic duct. So it is exocrine because it secretes pancreatic juice, which is transported by means of the pancreatic duct. It is endocrine simply because it secretes hormones, which hormones? Insulin as well as glucagon. So because these two are hormones, they are poured directly into the bloodstream. So that is the pancreas. So if this was to come in an exam and you are asked if the pancreas is endocrine or exocrine, our answer here is supposed to be both A and B. Now, in this topic, we're supposed to look and focus on different endocrine glands within the human body and be able to identify these endocrine glands, not only identify them, but also be able to describe the functions of the hormones that these endocrine glands secrete respectively. Now, above number A here, we are supposed to have another endocrine gland that is going to be secreted somewhere there, that is going to be located somewhere there. And the endocrine gland that is above endocrine gland number A here in the brain is what we call the hypothalamus. It is what we call the hypothalamus. Right? Now, below the hypothalamus in the brain is another endocrine gland, and this is what we call the pituitary gland. That is what we call the pituitary gland. Number 3. We also have another endocrine gland that is located in the neck area, just below the larynx, and this is what we call the thyroid gland. It actually looks like a bow tie. That is the thyroid gland. Now let's look at number C here. Now number C is located above the kidneys, and this is a gland that we simply refer to as the adrenal gland. That is a gland we refer to as the adrenal gland. Now let's look at the gland just below the kidneys. We have this gland here, and this gland is what we call the pancreas. This gland is what we call the pancreas. Remember, we said that the pancreas is an example of both endocrine as well as exocrine glands, right? Now let's look at D. D simply shows the structure of the female reproductive system, and D here represents the ovaries. It represents the ovaries, and E here simply shows us the testes. These are found in males. Now, these are all the endocrine glands that we have to focus on. But we also have to be able to identify the hormones that are secreted by each individual endocrine gland as well as state the functions of those hormones thereof. Now, before we can go deeper into these endocrine glands and the hormones that they secrete, let us try to find out exactly how these hormones work. Now, with an endocrine system, our story here will start first of all with an endocrine gland. It will start with an endocrine gland. Now, remember, we said that all endocrine glands are going to secrete a hormones. So endocrine glands are going to secrete what we call a hormone. But we also said that these hormones that are secreted by endocrine glands, they must be poured directly into the bloodstream. That is how hormones are transported throughout the body. So once this endocrine gland has secreted these hormones, it must be secreted directly into the bloodstream. It must be secreted directly into the bloodstream. Now, what happens when these hormones is secreted directly into the bloodstream? Well, it has to travel to a different part of the body where it is going to cause an effect, where it is going to cause a change. And the part that this hormone is going to travel to is what we call a target organ. This is where change is going to be effected. Right, so let's start again. Our story is going to start with an endocrine gland. An endocrine gland is going to secrete a hormone. The hormone that is secreted is going to be transported by means of the bloodstream. And once it is in the bloodstream, it is going to be transported into what we call a target organ. That is where the hormone is going to affect a change. Right. Now, let's look at endocrine gland number 1. Endocrine gland number 1 here is what we call the hypothalamus. Remember, we said that the hypothalamus is situated just above the pituitary gland in the brain. Now, when we talk about the hypothalamus secretes a hormone that we call ADH. Now, ADH is an abbreviation. It simply stands for the antidiuretic hormone. Let us write that down. So it is antidiuretic hormone, right? So that is the hypothalamus. It is going to secrete a hormone, and this hormone by name, we call it ADH. ADH simply stands for the antidiuretic hormone. Now remember, because ADH here is a hormone, it is secreted by an endocrine gland, which is the hypothalamus. Where is it secreted exactly? It is secreted into the bloodstream. Now, once the hormone is in the bloodstream, it has to travel to the target organ. Now, what is the target organ of ADH? It is the kidney. Specifically in the kidney, it is going to target a region that we call the distal convoluted tubule, as well as the collecting duct. That is why we've got the structure of the nephron listed below. Now, we studied this diagram in the previous grade in grade 11. But for the sake of explaining exactly how ADH functions, we're going to look at the structure of the nephron again. Now, the function of ADH here is said to be to regulate the water concentration in the blood. It controls how much water is available in the blood at any given time. Remember, the function of the endocrine system is to maintain homeostasis. It is to ensure that the internal environment remains constant. So, with regard to the hormone ADH, it makes sure that the water concentration in the blood does not decrease far below the normal limits, or it does not increase far above the normal limits. So that is what ADH is going to do. Now, let's look at exactly how ADH functions. Let's say we've got a situation where the water concentration in the blood now is too high. Let's say this is what we have. Now, we know that in the nephron, this is where water is going to be reabsorbed. The reabsorption of water occurs in the nephron. Remember, the structure that we call the nephron is found within the kidneys. Right. Now, we're going to have blood in this region. Let me change color. We're going to have blood come into this region. This is what we call the glomerulus. Right? Now, in the glomerulus, there's a process that is going to occur, and this is a process that we call glomerular filtration. Now, blood plasma here in the glomerulus is going to be injected into this part that we call the capsular space. But what enters the capsular space here is what now we're going to call glomerular filtrate. This is not important for you to note, by the way. It's going to be what we call glomerular filtrate. Now, this filtrate is going to travel all along these tubules, right? Until it reaches this part as well as this part. This is where we're going to focus on. Now, the function of ADH is that it controls the permeability of this part, and this part is called the distal convoluted tubule. And part number C here is what we call a collecting tubule. Right. Now, under the influence of ADH, this distal convoluted tubule and these collecting tubules, they become more permeable. So, if the hypothalamus is going to secrete more ADH, then this distal convoluted tubule is going to become more permeable to water. Now, what does the word more permeable mean? It simply means that it is going to become porous. More water is going to be able to pass through this part that we call the distal convoluted tubule. The same will also apply for the collecting tubule. So if more ADH is secreted into the blood, then these parts, the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubule, will become more permeable to water. They will become more porous. Now, there is water within these tubules. So in this part, there's going to be water. Remember, when water reaches this part, it is eventually going to reach the blood and you are going to urinate, right? But the body or the kidney is able to reabsorb water. And here we're simply stating the fact that this water that is reabsorbed by the body, it is reabsorbed in the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubules, right? So let's try to explain a situation where you have taken in too much water. Now, when you have taken in too much water, we're going to say, first of all, osmoreceptors that are located in the hypothalamus are going to be stimulated. Now, the word osmo simply refers to water. So whenever you see the word osmo, simply think of water, right? Now, these receptors that are stimulated by the concentration of water in the body. When there's too much water in the blood, when there's too much water in the blood, these receptors that we call the osmoreceptors that are found in the hypothalamus are going to be stimulated. But remember, the function of any receptor is simply to convert a stimulus into a nerve impulse. So once these osmoreceptors has been stimulated by a high concentration of water in the blood, they are going to convert the stimulus into a nerve impulse. This is actually our message saying that the water concentration now is too high. Now, the nerve impulse that is generated by these osmoreceptors, it is going to be transmitted to the pituitary gland. Why is it transmitted to the pituitary gland? It is going to be transmitted to the pituitary gland so that the pituitary gland can secrete less ADH. Now, let's pause here. We said that the hormone ADH was secreted by the hypothalamus, and that statement is true. The hypothalamus produces the hormone ADH, but once the hypothalamus has produced the hormone ADH, ADH is now going to be stored in the pituitary gland. So when ADH is released for use within the body, it is released from the pituitary gland, but in the pituitary gland, that is not where it is produced. It is actually produced in the hypothalamus, right? So that is why we say osmoreceptors, the receptors that detect the concentration of water in the body, we call them osmoreceptors. These osmoreceptors are situated in the hypothalamus. Now again, because these are receptors, they are going to convert the stimulus into nerve impulse. What is the stimulus in this case? The stimulus is that the concentration of water in the blood is too high. It is too much. Now, once these osmoreceptors have been stimulated, they are going to convert the stimulus into nerve impulse. Remember, a nerve impulse is simply a message. This message now is saying that the concentration of water in the blood is too high. Now, the nerve impulse now is going to be transmitted to the pituitary gland. Why to the pituitary gland? So that the pituitary gland can secrete less ADH. So this tells me that when the water concentration is too high, the amount of ADH that is secreted must be low. Why is this the case? This is simply because ADH stimulates the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubules to become more permeable to water. More water is able to pass through the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule. And if more water is able to pass through those two parts, more water is going to be reabsorbed. But we do not want to reabsorb more water in this case because the concentration of water in the blood is already high. So in this instance, we want to get rid of more water. So if we want to get rid of more water, we simply secrete less ADH. Why? Less ADH will cause the walls of the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubule to become what? Less permeable to water. Now, what does less permeable to water mean? When we say it causes them to become less permeable to water, we're simply saying that less water now is going to be able to pass through the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule. So more water is going to remain within the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubule. Now, because more water is going to remain within this tubule, it tells us that less water is going to leave the tubules and enter what we call the medulla. Now, the movement of water from the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule into this region of the kidney that we call the medulla occurs via a process that we call osmosis. Osmosis simply describes the diffusion of water, right? So less water is going to leave the tubules. This simply tells us that less water leaves the tubules, therefore more water remains within the tubules, right? Because less water was able to leave the tubule, it tells us that less water is also going to be reabsorbed. Because remember, we said that in order for the water to be reabsorbed, it must first leave the tubules via osmosis. But because we secreted less ADH, the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule are now less permeable to water. They allow less water to pass through them. Because less water passes through the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule into the medulla, it tells me that less water is reabsorbed and more water remains within the tubules, right? So that is why we're saying that less water here is reabsorbed. This is simply because more water remains in the tubules because the tubules are less permeable to water. What makes the tubules less permeable to water? It is the less ADH that is secreted, right? So less water is reabsorbed into the blood capillaries from the medulla. This statement, I think it makes sense now. Now, because less water is reabsorbed, therefore, more water remains inside of the tubules. And since more water remains inside of the tubule, the urine that is going to be formed thereof is going to be dilute. What do we mean when we say the urine is going to be dilute? We're simply saying that the urine is going to have a high concentration of water. That is, if we are to look at the color of the urine, it will look clear rather than yellowish. That is simply because it will contain a lot of water. Again, why is there a lot of water in this urine? This is simply because less ADH was secreted. And since less ADH was secreted, the walls of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule were less permeable to water. And if they are less permeable to water, therefore, less water was able to leave the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule into the medulla. Therefore, less water was reabsorbed, which means that more water remained inside of the tubules. Now, because more water remains inside of the tubules, there was more water that was contributed towards the formation of urine. So the urine that is formed now will have a higher concentration of water. And urine with a high concentration of water, we simply say it is dilute urine. So once this dilute urine is formed, it is going to be excreted from the body, and it is excreted from the body through urination. Now, because you are going to urinate a high volume of water, because you reabsorbed less, you are going to urinate a high volume of water. Therefore, the concentration of water in the blood now is going to decrease back to normal. It is going to decrease because you are reabsorbing less and secreting more. So the consequence there is that the concentration of water in the blood is going to do what? To decrease. Now, let's look at the opposite now. Let's look at when the concentration of water in the blood is low or it is very little. Now, our story starts the same. Osmoreceptors that are also found in the hypothalamus are going to be stimulated. Remember, osmoreceptors, these are receptors that are going to be able to detect change in the concentration of water that is in the blood. We call them osmoreceptors. And these osmoreceptors, we're saying they're found where? In the hypothalamus. Right. So now, because these are receptors, they're going to simply convert the stimulus into what? Into a nerve impulse. Remember, the function of any receptor is simply to convert a stimulus into a nerve impulse. Now, what is the stimulus in this instance? The stimulus now is that the concentration of water in the blood is too low. That is our stimulus. Now, this stimulus is going to be converted into a nerve impulse. A nerve impulse now is our message. The message will simply be saying that the concentration of water that is in the blood now is too low. What is going to happen? The nerve impulses are going to be transmitted to the what? To the pituitary gland. Now, because we have got very little water, the pituitary gland now is going to secrete more ADH into the blood. This is going to make sense simply because we know that ADH is a hormone, and all hormones are secreted directly into the what? Into the blood. So because the water concentration in the blood is low, it is very little, so more ADH here is going to be secreted. Now, let's look at the effect that more ADH has on the concentration of what? On the permeability of the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubule. Now, when the pituitary gland secrete more ADH will cause the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubule to now become what? More permeable to water. What does this mean? It means that if we secrete more ADH, then the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule will be more porous. They will allow more water to pass through them. And when more water passes through the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule, we say that they are more permeable to water. And what is causing them to become more permeable? It is the more ADH that is secreted by the pituitary gland into the blood. So if we secrete less ADH, the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule will become less permeable to water. So they will allow less water to pass through. But if we secrete more ADH, then the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule will become more permeable to water. Right. Now, because they are now more permeable to water, it tells me that more water now will leave these tubules. Which tubules by name? The distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubule. Because they are more porous, more water is going to be able to leave these tubules and enter which part? The medulla. Through which process? Osmosis. What is osmosis? Osmosis simply describes the diffusion of water. Now, because more water is moving from the tubules and entering the medulla through this osmosis, it tells me that in the medulla now there's going to be an increased concentration of water. There's going to be more water. And because there's more water in the medulla, therefore more water is going to also be what? To be reabsorbed into the blood capillaries. Because more water is available in the medulla, which means that also more water is going to be reabsorbed into the blood capillaries. Why the blood capillaries? Because the concentration of water is low in the blood. So more water must be reabsorbed into the blood. Right. Now, because we are reabsorbing more water now, then the urine that is formed is going to be concentrated. What do we mean when we say urine is concentrated? We're simply saying that the urine has got a very low concentration of water. There's very little water in this urine. Why is there very little water in the urine? Because more water was reabsorbed into the blood capillaries from the medulla. How did more water reach the medulla? Simply because the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule were more permeable to water. Why were they more permeable to water? Simply because more ADH was secreted. More ADH will cause the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule to become more permeable to water, therefore allowing more water to pass through. If more water passes through, it is going to be collected into the medulla. Once more water is available in the medulla, more water is also going to be reabsorbed by the blood capillaries. Now, because concentrated urine is formed, the water concentration in the blood now is going to increase back to normal. Why is it increasing? Because we're excreting less and reabsorbing more. So the consequence there is that the concentration of water is going to do what? To increase. That is why here we're saying that the concentration of water in the blood is going to increase back to normal. So that is how we describe osmoregulation, when the water is too much and when the water is very little. Going back to this diagram now, this is our distal convoluted tubule and this is our collecting tubule. If there is more ADH, if this is my distal convoluted tubule, for example, and there is water inside here, if more ADH is secreted, more ADH, then more water will leave these tubules via osmosis. But if less ADH is secreted, it tells me that very little water is going to leave the tubules and enter the medulla via osmosis. So more ADH, more permeable to water, less ADH, less permeable to water. Now, let's continue. Now, let's try to focus on this example that focuses on osmoregulation. Let's look at gland B there. Let's look down here. It says normal water level in the blood. Okay, let's go up. It says that the water level in the blood is going to drop. Okay, part A of the brain is stimulated. Now, let's try to look at part A. Now, we said that receptors responsible for detecting the change in the water concentration in the blood, we call them osmoreceptors. Now remember, we said that these osmoreceptors are found where? In the hypothalamus. So the part that is going to be stimulated, the part of the brain that is stimulated by a low or a high concentration of water, it is the hypothalamus. Specifically, it is the osmoreceptors that are found in the hypothalamus. But because it says part A of the brain, therefore part A has to be the what? The hypothalamus. But to be more specific, we know it is the osmoreceptors that are found in this hypothalamus. Right. Now, it says that gland B releases more hormone C into the blood. Now, here it says that gland B. So we know that part A is not the one that is going to release the hormone. It is gland B that is going to release the hormone now. And we know that the hypothalamus produces ADH. But the ADH that is produced by the hypothalamus, it is going to be stored in the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is where ADH is going to be released from. So when this diagram now says gland B releases more hormone C, we know that gland B now has to be the pituitary gland. And hormone C, we know it has to be what? To be ADH. How do we identify hormone C to be ADH? Because here we're dealing with the concentration of water that is in the blood. And the hormone responsible for regulating the amount of water that is available in the blood, it is the hormone ADH. So gland B has to be the pituitary gland, and the hormone that is secreted by the pituitary gland in response to the concentration of water in the blood, it is going to be ADH. Now, because the water level here, we're seeing that it has dropped, we must therefore release more ADH. Why? So that the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule become more permeable to water, and therefore more water is going to leave these tubules and enter the medulla, through which process? Osmosis. What is osmosis? That is the diffusion of water. Now, once more water is available in the medulla, what is going to happen? More water is going to be reabsorbed into the blood capillaries. Now, because we are reabsorbing more water, we are going to secrete less water. So the urine that is formed now is going to have very little water, and we call this concentrated urine. Now, because we are secreting less, we are reabsorbing more water and excreting less water, we say that the concentration of water now is going to rise back to normal, simply because we are reabsorbing more and excreting less. Right? Now, it is said that this hormone C will go to part D in the kidneys. So part D in the kidneys, we know that ADH is going to affect two parts that are found within the kidneys. That is the distal convoluted tubule as well as the collecting tubules. By the way, you're not supposed to write them this way. You're supposed to write them in full. So part D in the kidneys, it is the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule. Because here there's more ADH secreted, then the distal convoluted tubule and collecting tubule will become more permeable to water. and then it says that the water level in the blood rises. Why does it rise? Because more water was able to leave the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting tubule and enter the medulla. Because there's more water in the medulla, more water is reabsorbed by the blood capillaries, therefore less water is excreted. Because we reabsorbed more water and excreted less water, then the concentration of water is going to increase back to normal, and the urine that is formed thereof, it is going to be highly concentrated because it has got a lower concentration of water. Right. Now, let's look at the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is found just below the hypothalamus in the brain, right? Now, the pituitary gland, we're going to focus on 5 hormones that are secreted by the pituitary gland. Number 1, we're going to look at a hormone that is called the growth hormone. Now, I think just looking at the name of the hormone itself, it is quite obvious to come up with the function of the growth hormone, and that is that it simply regulates body growth, right? Now, remember, we said that each and every hormone now is secreted by an endocrine gland. Once it is secreted by an endocrine gland, it is going to be secreted directly into the bloodstream, from where it is going to be transported into the target organ. Now, we're saying that the target organ for the growth hormone now, it is the long bones as well as the muscles. These are the skeletal muscles, right? Now, because this growth hormone causes a change or an effect in these two parts, in the long bones and the muscles, we therefore say that it regulates the body, the growth of the body as a whole, because it regulates the growth of long bones as well as the growth of muscles. Now, the secretion of this growth hormone, it is very important in young children. Why is this the case? Because a normal secretion of growth hormone in young children will result in that child growing to be an adult of a normal size, right? We're not going to say that this person is maybe too large or too small. They're going to be a normal sized human being. But there is a problem with growth hormone in the sense that in young children, we may have an over-secretion of the growth hormone. Now, what do we mean when we say we may have an over-secretion? That is to say that it is possible for a large concentration of growth hormone to be secreted at a time in young children. And if there's an over-secretion of the growth hormone, the child is going to grow into a very large adult. They're going to be very big when they grow old. And this results in a condition that we call gigantism. They literally grow into what we call a giant. So the long bones and the muscles here, they grow at a pace that is faster than normal. And this is simply because there's going to be an over-secretion. There's going to be too much growth hormone. And the condition that is going to result thereof, we call it gigantism. Right. Number 2, it is possible to have an under-secretion of growth hormone in young children. When we say there is an under-secretion, we're saying that the concentration of growth hormone that is secreted is too low. And when we're secreting a low concentration of the growth hormone in young children, it tells us that the long bones of these children, as well as the skeletal muscles, they're going to develop at a pace that is slower than normal. Now, this is going to result in this child growing into a very small adult. They're going to be an adult, but they're going to be a very small human being. And this is a condition that we call dwarfism. So they're going to grow into what we call essentially a dwarf. This is a very small adult. This is caused by an under-secretion of the growth hormone. But if there's an over-secretion, it is gigantism. Under-secretion of the growth hormone, it is going to lead to dwarfism. Right. Now, let's come to hormone number 2 that is secreted by the pituitary gland, and that is a hormone that we call prolactin. Now, again, because prolactin is a hormone, it is secreted by an endocrine gland, the pituitary gland, directly into the bloodstream. Now, what is the function of prolactin? The prolactin simply stimulates the mammary glands to secrete milk, right? So the target organ for prolactin is the mammary glands. Where do we find these mammary glands? We find them in the breast, right? So they stimulate these glands that we call the mammary glands that are found in the breast to secrete milk, to start producing milk, right? Now, the process for producing milk, we simply call it lactation. So prolactin, in a sense, simply control the process of lactation. This simply refers to the production of milk. This milk is produced in the mammary glands under the influence of which hormone? Prolactin, which is secreted by which endocrine gland? The pituitary gland. Right. Now let's come to FSH. Now we focused on FSH during human reproduction, right? But let's focus on it again. So FSH is also a hormone. It is secreted by the pituitary gland. Now we know that FSH is also an abbreviation. It simply stands for the follicle stimulating hormone. Now, since it is a hormone, it is secreted directly into the bloodstream. And what is the target organ of FSH? It is the Graafian follicle that are located inside of the ovaries. Now, exactly what is the function of FSH inside of the Graafian follicle? It simply stimulates the development of ova inside the Graafian follicle. Now, we know that inside each and every Graafian follicle is an ova at different stages of development, right? So FSH simply stimulates the development of those ova that are inside of the Graafian follicle. Now, in simple language, in simple terms, FSH simply make the Graafian follicle to grow bigger. And when they grow bigger, the ovum that is also inside is also going to grow bigger. So it is going to develop, right? So we also have LH. LH is also secreted by the pituitary gland. It is an abbreviation simply standing for the luteinizing hormone. It is also secreted directly into the bloodstream simply because it is a hormone. What is the target organ of LH? It is the Graafian follicles also that are found inside of the ovaries. Now, exactly what is the function of LH? Number one, it stimulates the process of ovulation. Now, we know that when ovulation occurs, the largest Graafian follicle inside of the ovaries is simply going to rupture and release an ovum. Now, the process through which this Graafian follicle ruptures to release an ovum, we simply refer to this process as what? As ovulation. It occurs on day 14 of the menstrual cycle of the ovarian cycle, right? Now, function number 2 of LH is that it also stimulates the conversion of the ruptured Graafian follicle into a structure that we call the corpus luteum. Now, we know that once this Graafian follicle has ruptured and released this ovum in a process that we call ovulation, under the influence of this hormone LH, this ruptured Graafian follicle is also going to be converted. What do we mean it is going to be converted? We're simply saying that it is going to be changed from one form to another. So it is going to be changed from a ruptured Graafian follicle into a structure that we call the corpus luteum. Those are the functions of the hormone LH. Now, why is it necessary to form the structure that we call the corpus luteum? Well, the corpus luteum is responsible for secreting the hormone progesterone. And we know that the function of progesterone is simply to maintain pregnancy. Exactly how does progesterone maintain pregnancy? By maintaining the thickened lining of the uterus, which is the endometrium. It simply ensures that the endometrium simply remains thicker, vascular, and glandular, right? Now, let's look at hormone number last, and hormone number last secreted by the pituitary gland is the hormone TSH. Now, TSH is also an abbreviation. It simply stands for the thyroid stimulating hormone. So this hormone is also secreted by the pituitary gland, right? Now, exactly what is the function of this hormone that we call TSH? Well, the function of TSH is that it simply stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxin. Now, TSH is the only hormone that we are going to focus on that is going to affect how another endocrine gland functions. So TSH is secreted from another endocrine gland, and it is going to affect the functioning of another endocrine gland. So it is the only one that we're going to focus on. It is TSH. Right. Now, because it is a hormone, it is secreted by an endocrine gland, which is the pituitary gland. Exactly how is it secreted? It is secreted directly into the bloodstream. What is the target organ now of TSH? It is the thyroid gland. Remember, we said that the thyroid gland is located in the neck region and it looks like a bow tie. Right. Now, exactly how does TSH affect how the thyroid gland secretes the hormone thyroxin? Well, if the pituitary gland secretes more TSH, then the thyroid gland now is going to be stimulated to secrete more thyroxin. But if the pituitary gland secretes less TSH, then the thyroid gland now is going to be stimulated to secrete less thyroxine. So let's try to look at it again. The function of TSH is that it stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxine. So this tells me that in order for the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxine, there must be the hormone TSH from the pituitary gland. This is simply because TSH, its function, it stimulates this thyroid gland to secrete thyroxine. So without thyroxine, without TSH rather, then the thyroid gland will not secrete thyroxine, because it has to be instructed by the pituitary gland through the hormone TSH to secrete the hormone what? Thyroxine. So once more, if the pituitary gland secretes more TSH, then the thyroid gland will respond by secreting what? More thyroxine. But if the pituitary glands secrete less TSH, then the thyroid gland will respond by secreting less thyroxine. It will be stimulated to secrete what? Less thyroxine. So let's try to look at this diagram. Now, this diagram simply say the pituitary gland will secrete hormone A. How do we identify hormone A? Well, we can see that hormone A now is targeting gland B. And we know that gland B here in the neck region, it is simply the thyroid gland. Now, there's only one hormone that is secreted by the pituitary gland, which is located in the head somewhere, in the brain rather. There's only one hormone secreted by the pituitary gland that affects the functioning of the thyroid gland, which is the hormone what? TSH. So hormone number A simply has to be what? TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. But here the thyroid gland is responding by secreting hormone C. But we know that the function of the hormone TSH is that it stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxine. So this hormone C is being secreted in response to hormone A that was secreted by the what? By the pituitary gland. So hormone A here has to be the hormone what? Thyroxine. And thyroxine, we know it is secreted by the what? By the thyroid gland. So this is how we are going to interpret this diagram. Let's continue. Now, let's look at our last endocrine gland for today, and that is the thyroid gland. Now, the thyroid gland, as we've already said, it is located in the neck region, and it simply secretes the hormone thyroxine. But now we know that in order for the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxine, it must be under the influence of the hormone TSH, which is secreted by the pituitary gland, because we know that the function of the hormone TSH is simply to stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxine. If there is more TSH that is secreted by the pituitary gland, we know that the thyroid gland will respond by secreting more thyroxine. But if there is less TSH that is secreted by the pituitary gland, we know that the thyroid gland will respond by secreting less thyroxine, right? Now, this hormone thyroxine, it is secreted directly into the bloodstream because it is a hormone. Now, what is the target organ for thyroxine? It is simply the body cells, right? All of the body cells. Now, what is the main function of this hormone that we refer to as thyroxine? Thyroxine simply functions to regulate the metabolic rate. The word metabolic simply taken from the word metabolism. Metabolism referring to all chemical processes that occur within a cell. Now, an example of these chemical processes that occur within cells is cellular respiration. We'll have to come back to cellular respiration, right? So cellular respiration is an example of chemical processes that occurs within a cell. And we know that chemical processes that occur within a cell, we refer to these processes as metabolism. And the rate in which these processes occur, we call it the metabolic rate. And this metabolic rate is regulated or controlled by the hormone thyroxine, right? So that is the main function of the hormone thyroxine. It regulates the metabolic rate. Now, there is a problem with an over-secretion of thyroxine, and we also have a problem with an under-secretion of thyroxine. Now, when we've got an over-secretion of thyroxine, this is when you are going to secrete a higher concentration of thyroxine than normal. It is too much. So when we secrete too much thyroxine, this condition, we call it hyperthyroidism. hyperthyroidism. This is when you secrete a thyroxine that is higher than normal. It is too much. But if you secrete very little thyroxine, it is another condition now that we call hypothyroidism. So hyper, too much thyroxine. Hypo, very little thyroxine. So hyperthyroidism, there's an oversecretion of thyroxine. Hypothyroidism, there is an under secretion of thyroxine. Now we're going to focus on these two types of disorders and also the effect that they have on weight later on. So hold on to that one. Right. Now, what is most important is that there is a nutrient that is called iodine. Now, it is very important that the food that we eat contains this nutrient that we call iodine. Now, why is it important for the food that we eat to contain the nutrient that we call iodine? Well, it is because iodine is essential. It is important for the production of the hormone thyroxine. So it tells me that without the nutrient iodine, there is no thyroxine that is going to be produced. So what happens if the food that we eat was without iodine? We had no intake of iodine. Well, it is going to result in a disorder. This disorder is going to result in the thyroid gland enlarging. So, for example, let's say this is the normal size of an endocrine gland. Under a condition where the food that we eat does not contain iodine, it is going to enlarge. So we're going to have a thyroid gland that is larger than normal. Now, when the thyroid gland enlarges to this size, into a size that is larger than normal, we call this condition an endemic goitre. Now, a condition called an endemic goitre is caused by the absence of the nutrient iodine. Right? So again, iodine is essential for the production of thyroxine. Without iodine, thyroxine is not going to be produced, and this is going to result in a disorder. What is this disorder? It is the enlarging of the thyroid gland. It is going to grow larger, so it is going to become something like this. Now, when the thyroid gland becomes enlarged due to an absence of iodine, we call this condition an endemic goitre. Right. Now, let's look at what we call a negative feedback mechanism that has to do with thyroxine. Now, this is how the body is able to maintain a constant level of thyroxine. Remember when we said, we talked about homeostasis, we said that homeostasis simply refers to the ability of the body to maintain a constant internal environment. Right? So this negative feedback mechanism of thyroxine, it simply ensures that the concentration of thyroxine within the body remains more or less the same. It does not increase far above normal limits and it does not decrease way below the normal limits. Right? So now let's look at a condition where the concentration of thyroxine is too high. Now, we said that when the blood thyroxine concentration is high, the pituitary gland is going to be stimulated. Now, this is very important to note. The part that is going to detect that the concentration of thyroxine is too high, it is the pituitary gland and not the thyroid gland. Simply because, remember, the hormone thyroxine is secreted by the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland, its sole function here is simply to secrete the hormone thyroxine. But remember, the thyroid gland secretes the hormone thyroxine under the influence of the hormone TSH. In TSH, we said that it is secreted by the pituitary gland. So when the concentration of thyroxine now increases far beyond normal limits, it is going to be detected by the pituitary gland. That is why we say that when the concentration of thyroxine in the blood increases, the pituitary gland is going to be what? It is going to be stimulated. Now, because the concentration of thyroxine is too high, the pituitary gland now is going to be stimulated to secrete less TSH. Now, why is the pituitary gland supposed to secrete less TSH? Well, this is simply because we know that the function of TSH is simply to stimulate the secretion of the hormone thyroxine by the thyroid gland. So if we secrete less TSH, then the thyroid gland now is going to be stimulated to secrete less thyroxine. Because remember, for the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxine, it is under the influence of the hormone TSH. Now, because initially we said that the concentration of thyroxine is too high, then the pituitary gland will be stimulated and it will secrete less TSH. Remember, less TSH simply stimulates the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxine. Now, because we have secreted less TSH, then the thyroid gland now is going to be stimulated by this less TSH to secrete what? Less thyroxine. Now, because the thyroid gland now is stimulated to secrete less thyroxine, then the concentration of thyroxine in the blood is simply going to drop back to normal. So it was too high. When it was too high, the pituitary gland was stimulated. The pituitary gland, when it is stimulated, it is going to secrete less TSH. This is simply because less TSH will stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete less thyroxine. Because now less thyroxine is being secreted, then the concentration of thyroxine in the blood will consequently drop back to normal. But what about the opposite? What if the concentration of thyroxine is too low? Well, the pituitary gland is still going to be stimulated here. So this tells me that irrespective of whether the concentration of thyroxine is too high or it is too low, the part that is going to be stimulated, it is the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is the one that is going to detect if there is a problem with the concentration of thyroxine in the blood. Right? Now, we are saying that the concentration of thyroxine in this scenario, it is very low. So the pituitary gland now is going to be stimulated to secrete more TSH. Why more TSH? Simply because more TSH will stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete what? More thyroxine. Now, because more TSH was stimulated, remember, we said that the function of the hormone TSH is simply to stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxine. But because the concentration of thyroxine now is low, we want the concentration of thyroxine to rise back to normal. So the pituitary gland here is going to be stimulated and it will secrete more TSH. Now, once the pituitary gland has secreted more TSH, the thyroid gland now is going to be stimulated by this more TSH to also secrete what? More thyroxine. Now, once the thyroid gland has been stimulated to secrete more thyroxine, then the concentration of thyroxine in the blood is going to rise. It is going to increase back to what? To normal limits. So that is the negative feedback mechanism involving the hormone thyroxine. When the concentration of thyroxine is too high, we secrete less TSH. And when we secrete less TSH, the thyroid gland will secrete less thyroxine. And when the thyroid gland secretes less thyroxine, then the concentration of thyroxine in the blood will drop back to normal. But when the concentration of thyroxine is too low, then the pituitary gland will be stimulated now to secrete more TSH. Once it has secreted more TSH, then the thyroid gland is also going to be stimulated by more TSH in order to secrete more thyroxine. Because now we're secreting more thyroxine, then the concentration of thyroxine in the blood is going to rise, or it is going to increase back to normal. Right. Now, with what we know with regard to the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, TSH, and thyroxine, let's try to break down this diagram. Right. Now, our clue here is going to be the pituitary gland and this statement that is saying more thyroid stimulating hormone. This is simply because we know that the pituitary gland does indeed secrete the hormone TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone. But we also know that the target organ for TSH is the thyroid gland, right? Because we said that the function of TSH is simply to stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete the hormone thyroxine. So once this pituitary gland has secreted more thyroid stimulating hormone, this TSH is going to go to the target organ for TSH, and that target organ here is represented as 1. So we can conclude now that 1 is the thyroid gland. We can conclude that it is the thyroid gland. This is simply because we know that the target organ for TSH is the thyroid gland. And if we look at this TSH, it goes directly into number 1. So number 1 has to be the thyroid gland. Right. Now, this more thyroid stimulating hormone entered in the top arrow here, because we've got the arrow at the top and we also have this arrow at the bottom, right? But this more TSH entered here at the top. Now, the response for more TSH is represented by this line, and consequently it says more of hormone 3. Now, we know that if the pituitary gland secretes more TSH, then the thyroid gland must respond by secreting more what? More thyroxin. So hormone number 3 here can only be more thyroxin. That is the only possible answer. So because of more TSH secreted by the pituitary gland, it is going to stimulate the thyroid gland, which is number 1. Once the thyroid gland has been stimulated by more TSH, it will respond by also secreting more thyroxine. Now, let's look at the lines that are going up. No, so it is this one. So it enters here at the bottom. But we know that from the pituitary gland to up here, it says that less 2. Now, we know that this less 2 is affecting our thyroid gland here. And the only hormone that is secreted by the pituitary gland that will affect the thyroid gland, we know that it is TSH, which means that hormone number 2 can only be the thyroid stimulating hormone. Right. So it is going to the target organ for TSH. We already know it is the what? It is the thyroid gland. Hence, we said that number 1 is the thyroid gland. But this arrow for less TSH entered at the bottom here. So the response for less TSH is this one at the bottom. And it says less of 4. And we know that if we secrete less TSH, then we're also going to have less what? We're going to have less thyroxine. That is how the thyroid gland is going to respond. So under the influence of less TSH from the pituitary gland, then the thyroid gland is going to be stimulated to simply secrete less thyroxine. And that is how we interpret a diagram like this one. Right, let's go to slide number last, and here we're going to look at the effect of thyroxine concentration on body weight. Now, here you will notice that we focus specifically on hyperthyroidism as well as hypothyroidism. This is simply because we have already stated that hyperthyroidism, this is when the concentration of thyroxine now is higher than normal. It remains high. And hypo, this is when the concentration of thyroxine is very low. This is the under-secretion of thyroxine. It results in hypothyroidism. And then over-secretion of thyroxine results in hyperthyroidism. Now, remember we said that the function of thyroxine is that thyroxine regulates the metabolic rate. And by metabolic rate, we said that the word metabolic was taken from the word metabolism. And metabolism simply refers to all chemical processes that occurs within cells. And we gave an example of chemical processes that occur within cells, and we focus specifically on cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration is a type of metabolism. It is a type of a metabolic process. Right. So, if the concentration of thyroxine increases, then the rate of metabolism will also increase. But if the concentration of thyroxine decreases, then the rate of metabolism will also decrease. But remember here we're saying that cellular respiration is a type of metabolism. So if the concentration of thyroxine increases, then the rate of cellular respiration will also increase. And if the concentration of thyroxine decreases, then the rate of cellular respiration is also going to do what? To decrease. Right. But when we talk about cellular respiration, this is a process whereby glucose is broken down to release energy. Right. So here we break down glucose. That is during cellular respiration. So if we say the rate of cellular respiration is high, then more glucose is going to be broken down. If we say the rate of cellular respiration is low, then less glucose is going to be broken down, right? So let's take it back. So if we increase the concentration of thyroxine, then the rate of metabolism is going to be high. And if the metabolic rate is high, then the rate of cellular respiration is also going to be what? To be high. And if the rate of cellular respiration is high, then more glucose is going to be broken down, right? But if we secrete less thyroxine, then the metabolic rate now is going to be low. And if the metabolic rate is low, then the rate of cellular respiration is also going to be low. And if the rate of cellular respiration is low, then less glucose is going to be broken down in order to release what? Energy. Right. So let's look at the effect of hyperthyroidism, at the effect of oversecretion of thyroxine on body weight. Now, we said that hyperthyroidism will cause an increased metabolic rate. So, since the function of thyroxine is to regulate the metabolic rate, when we've got thyroxine that is higher than normal, then the metabolic rate is also going to increase accordingly. So more thyroxine will simply result in an increased rate of metabolism, because the function of thyroxine is to regulate the metabolic rate, right? So because the metabolic rate now is increased or is high, then also the rate of cellular respiration is also going to be increased. It is also going to be high, because we said that cellular respiration is a type of a metabolic process, right? So again, hyperthyroidism, that is when we secrete, when we have an oversecretion of thyroxine. Because the function of thyroxine is to regulate the metabolic rate, then it says that hyperthyroidism will cause an increased metabolic rate. Now we know that, we know that cellular respiration is a type of a metabolic process. So because the metabolic rate here has increased, then the rate at which the process of cellular respiration occurs will also do what? Will also increase. But because the rate of cellular respiration has increased, then more glucose is going to be what? To be broken down. More glucose is going to be used. And if more glucose is used, then less glucose is going to be converted into glycogen and stored. Now, what is glycogen? Glycogen simply refers to the stored form of glucose in animals. So when we store a glucose as animals, as human being, we store that glucose as glycogen. But in plants, glucose is stored as what we call starch. But here, because we're talking about endocrine systems and homeostasis in humans, then our glucose here is going to be stored as glycogen. Now, because this is hyperthyroidism, and we say that it will result in an increased metabolic rate, which result in an increased rate of cellular respiration. Now, we know that cellular respiration simply refers to the process through which glucose is broken down to release energy. Because the rate of cellular respiration is high, then more glucose is going to be what? Is going to be used during cellular respiration. Now, because more glucose is used, then less glucose is what? Is stored. And we know that glucose is stored as what? As glycogen. So that is why we're saying that less glucose is going to be converted into glycogen and what? And stored. Now, as a consequence, fat is going to be broken down. And if fat is broken down, you are simply going to lose weight. So when you have got hyperthyroidism, you are going to lose a lot of weight. And this is how you explain it. Now let's look at the effect of hypothyroidism on weight. Now, hypothyroidism will result in a decreased metabolic rate. Again, we know that hypothyroidism, this is when we've got an under secretion of thyroxine. So the concentration of thyroxine that is secreted is very low, right? So when we've got this under secretion of thyroxine, so the rate of cellular respiration here is also going to be low. We'll have a decreased rate of cellular respiration. Now remember, we said that during cellular respiration, glucose is broken down to release energy. But because the rate through which this process is occurring is decreased, then less glucose is consequently going to be used. So less glucose is used. And if we use less glucose, then more glucose here is going to be converted into glycogen and stored. Remember, we said that glycogen, this is simply the stored form of glucose in animals. So in me and you, glucose is going to be stored as glycogen. Here we're going to have more glucose. Why more glucose? Because less glucose is used. Why is less glucose used? The rate of cellular respiration is low. Why is the rate of cellular respiration low? Because the metabolic rate is also low. Why is the metabolic rate low? Because we have got a low concentration of thyroxine, right? Now, because more glucose is converted into glycogen and stored, which means that fat is also not broken down. It is not necessary to break down fat. And if fat is not broken down, you gain weight. So this is how hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism is going to affect body weight. Now, if you like what I've to say, please consider liking the channel and subscribing. Until next time, bye-bye.